Chapter 24 of Doxie Dent by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The inevitable. The old clogger's cup was now full. Shame, self-reproach, and fear of finally losing his niece struggled together within him until he could neither work nor think, and at last he was driven, in sheer desperation, to unbosom himself to Sam Speck, and in his roundabout clumsy way to ask his advice and assistance. It took them some time to get anything practical, for Sam, inflated with the novel dignity of mentor for his great chief, insisted upon delivering a long and very pointed address on the folly and sinfulness of obstinacy, and almost goaded the cowed and penitent clogger to rebellion as he descanted on the wonderful conditions things might have been now in if his advice had been taken. When all this had been got through, however, Sam comforted the heart of his old friend by assuring him that if Doxie wanted to go, she would go, and if she wanted to stay, she would stay, reminding him also that both she and Andrew were of age by this time, and might be expected, within reasonable limits, to wish to please themselves. Now Sam said these and many other unnecessary things, because he really saw no way out of the difficulty himself, but hoped that discussion might suggest something. And sure enough, just at this point he had one of his rare inspirations. But as he did not wish the clogger to think he had only just thought of it, he beat about the bush a little longer, and then, by little particles, let out his great plan. What it was will be seen presently. But after the clogger had offered his counsellor a most unusual compliment, and they had arranged all the details of their great conspiracy, they parted, and the next afternoon Sam, in pursuance of the scheme already agreed upon, was waiting in the triangle opposite the cloggery when the extra Saturday afternoon coach from Duxbury arrived. As he anticipated, Andrew Barber alighted from the conveyance, and was just turning round to go down the Brew, when Sam touched him on the shoulder and informed him that the clogger wanted to speak to him before he went any farther. Andrew, somewhat astonished and perplexed, and withal a little impatient, followed his conductor towards the house door, which Sam, as soon as he had admitted Andrew, immediately closed from the outside, thus leaving the young man alone with his old enemy. Jabe was sitting before the fire with his short leg on the hob, and seemed not for a moment to have noticed the entrance of his visitor. As Andrew approached him, however, he turned round with a transparently affected look of surprise, and then pointed, without speaking, to a chair. "You wish to see me, I hear, Mr. Longworth," said Andrew, dropping into the offered seat. "Mr. Longworth, Mr. Longworth, how long is it sin' aw gan aw bein' called Jabe?" And the clogger looked at his visitor with apparent sternness. "Oh well, thank you. Mr. Jabe, then. I think you've something to say to me." "Ay, Aw've had summat to say to you for a long time, but you ne'er gan me chance." And Jabe looked drearily at the curling smoke as it rose from the bowl of his pipe. "Indeed, sir, I shall be glad to hear what it is." Jabe looked as if the conversation was not taking exactly the course he wished, and he affected to appear very dubious about Andrew's last remark. "You'll happen no be so fain to hear it when Aw tell you what it is." "Indeed? Sorry to hear that. But what is it, Mr. Jabe?" Jabe looked as if he would have liked to explode upon Andrew for still using such stiff English, but it was time they came to business. He took 2 or 3 pulls at his pipe, and then, without turning his head, said, "Aw allus thowt as you were a chap as hed plenty o' pluck." "Pluck? Nothing to boast of, I'm afraid. But what do—" But the clogger, entirely disregarding Andrew's remarks, here interrupted. "An' they tell me as when you're taken howd of a thing, you niver let go." "They are very complimentary, whoever they are. But what does all this matter?" Jabe smoked on, as if Andrew had never spoken, and presently resumed. "If a wench is worth having at aw, who's worth feighting for?" "Really, Mr. Jabe, I cannot understand." But here the clogger could contain himself no longer, and so, whisking suddenly round in his chair, He rose to his feet, and shaking his fist at Andrew, he demanded, "What I want to know is this. Are you going to let yond wench go to Australia, or are you not?" Now Andrew had not as yet heard anything of this second projected emigration, and so, opening his eyes very widely, he demanded, "Mr. Jabez, whatever are you talking about?" "Talking about? I'm talking about you. You're going meathering about with them mully-coddling books of yours while yond wench is slipping through your finger. That's what I'm talking about. Don't you know as yon wastrel's tacking her back to Australia?" The puckers suddenly faded out of Andrew's face. He knew enough of Doxie to be sure of his ground as far as she was concerned, but he was reminding himself of the estrangement between the clogger and his sweetheart, and so he looked steadily at Jabe and inquired, "Well, you won't mind that at any rate, will you? Doxie's nothing to you, you know now." This was hitting the poor clogger very hard indeed, and he felt it all the more because it was so entirely unexpected. He winced visibly, dropped his head, and then, with a sullen growl, he put out his arm and cried, mind me! What are you going to do? That's the pint." And Andrew, who was rather wickedly enjoying Jabe's evident distress, answered with assumed carelessness, "Oh, that's Doxie's affair. She'll take care of herself, don't fear." Jabe's condition was pitiable to behold. He was making no headway, and the iron was striking deeper every moment. He paused and drew a long breath, and at last, throwing off all pretence, he burst out in tones that were quite pathetic, and that touched Andrew in spite of himself. "Ah, look here, young felly. Do you want yond wench to go to Australia, or do you not?" "Oh, I don't, of course." "Well, then," and here Jabe became wonderfully confidential and almost coaxing, "you mun wed her and keep her here. You mun elope wi' her, and run off wi' her, and do owt as yo'n a mind wi' her, nobbut keep her here, and all done by you, and fine for brass." By this time, however, Andrew's patience was exhausted, and so to get away he thanked the clogger very warmly and promised to do his best, and a few minutes later he was sitting over his tea at Aunt Judy's. Thomas Dent happened to be out. He generally managed to be so when Andrew was about, for there was no love lost between the two, though Andrew, for Doxie's sake, contrived to conceal his feelings as much as possible. They had finished the meal, and Doxie was just preparing to go for their usual walk to Beckbottom, when Andrew dropped a word or two about his interview with her uncle. Doxie was all eagerness in a moment, and before he had finished his story she abruptly left him, and a moment afterwards was rushing up the Brew as fast as she could go. Before the clogger could realise what had happened, she had burst into the house and had taken him by the neck and was kissing him as though she never intended to cease. Andrew not only missed his expected walk that night, but Thomas Dent found that neither coaxings nor threats could get his daughter away from her old home, and she established herself, in spite of everything and everybody, once more as her uncle's housekeeper, whilst Andrew, with affected jealousy, yet with real joy in his heart, had to do his courting henceforth in the Clog Shop parlour. However, they were not yet quite out of the wood. Thomas Dent was inclined to be awkward. Neither Jabe nor Andrew had treated him, he thought, with proper respect, and he said to his wife, what he was evidently afraid to say to Doxie herself, that he had a good mind to spoil her spooning and teach her that he was not to be trifled with. Somehow he had been disappointed in this great return of his, and said more than once to Doxie's mother that he was sorry that he had come home. But when the news that he was to return almost immediately got noised abroad, people began openly to sneer at his pretensions to wealth, and Sam amused himself by telling him, whenever he came to the Clog Shop fire, of this and that good thing in the way of investments, always quoting large figures on the assumption that nothing smaller would be worth the Australian hero's notice. Jabe greatly enjoyed his friend's sallies, and chuckled inwardly as he watched Thomas's evident embarrassment. But one day Sam hazarded the prediction that Thomas would not return to Australia after all. He wouldn't be able to find the money. At which the clogger took alarm, and declared that he would take care he did go, even if he had to find the passage money himself. Thomas seemed to wither under his growing unpopularity, and became impatient to get away, but in order to recover himself somewhat in popular esteem before he went, he affected to make a great virtue of consenting that Doxie should remain, and he insisted that the marriage should take place before he and his wife, departed. Then, seeing that by this means he was recovering himself in popular favour, he began to hasten on the preparations, and instructed Doxie to spare no expense, but to give these Becksiders something to remember. Doxie and her sweetheart took it all very quietly. They had soon decided that her father need not be considered in the arrangements, and his sudden disposition to help things really made little difference. At last the happy day was fixed, and Beckside began to prepare itself for another sensation. By Jabe's express orders, the chapel was cleaned from floor to ceiling, and the paint touched up wherever it was discovered to need it. The super was retained for the occasion, a full month before the date fixed, and Jabe and Sam solemnly discussed the question as to whether it was not the correct thing to send the officiating minister some sort of fitting apparel, such as a hatband or gloves at least. The band, of course, was to officiate at the ceremony, but when Doxie insisted that the proper thing would be for the doctor's wife to play a wedding march on the organ, they set to work to prepare to lead up the wedding procession. Doxie explained that that was not the correct thing, and so they hit upon the happy idea of meeting Andrew at his father's house and marching him up to the chapel, and it was only when she discovered that her uncle was getting warm about the matter that she consented. A day or two later, however, she hit upon an expedient, and asked her uncle why he was not going to be of the wedding party itself. This was a new view of the case, and so the clogger gave way as far as he was concerned, and finally it was settled that the musicians were to perform outside the chapel whilst the organ was doing its work inside. Never was there so much utterly reckless expenditure on mere fine clothing as on the days preceding the great event. Jabe, of course, must have an entirely new suit of black and some wonderful new fronts. Sam Speck borrowed a dress suit from a cousin of his, who had once attended the Mayor of Duxbury's reception, and it was only after he had given one or two strictly private exhibitions of himself in these marvellous garments that Doxie discovered what was on foot, and asked him and induced him to abandon the clothes in favour of a grand waistcoat which Luke Yates had had for his wedding. The happy morning came at last, and proved as fine a one as the most superstitious bride could wish. There was an immemorial tradition in Beckside that the bride should not be seen on her wedding day until she appeared ready to be led to the altar. But Doxie was up almost before daylight, and waiting in her own gayest fashion upon those who were supposed to have come to wait upon her. Her mother was dressed before breakfast, and was so afraid of spoiling her new finery that no possible persuasion could induce her to partake of food. Leah Yates came early to assist in dressing the bride, and had just got into her happy task when Aunt Judy came back from the clog shop, almost crying, and denouncing her brother as the most awkward and unmanageable man ever made. Doxie saw at once that something was wrong, and gradually drew out of her aunt the intelligence that she had been engaged for the last hour in trying to fix Jabe's new front, and that at last her uncle had got into such a pet that he had actually thrown the offending garment on the back of the fire. Bride or no bride, Doxie was off in a moment up to the cloggery, where she found Jabe sitting half-dressed in a chair, and looking the very picture of wretchedness. In a few minutes she had him smiling, and though he did not understand what she was doing to the second front which she unearthed from somewhere, he looked at himself in something like terror when she led him to the glass, and showed him an immaculate piece of linen with 2 dazzling real gold studs in it, her own secret gift to him. Then she scurried off back to her own toilet, whilst the clogger went over and inspected Sam, who had already been dressed some time. Presently there was a cry in the village that the coaches were coming. Real grey horses with white tassels on their ears. Oh, what a commotion they did make! Then the band, consisting of all those who were not required for more important business, came and planted itself before the clog shop and solemnly played the Old Hundredth. After this the coaches came dashing up the Brue with the bridegroom inside, and the chapel became the centre of attraction. It was crowded long before the time appointed, and when at last the bride's coach left Aunt Judy's little cottage, the bystanders sent up a great cheer, and the band hastily picked up their music holders and raced along towards the chapel. Doxie looked undeniably pretty as she came to the communion rail on the arm of her father, and it seemed only right that Jabe should bring the bride's mother. Andrew was almost forgotten in the interest shown in the others, and it was only when his sonorous voice repeated the sentence that people realised his presence. "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" said the minister, and he glanced quietly up at Doxie's father. That good man, however, had not expected to be thus publicly challenged, and before he could recover himself to do his part, a hard elbow had been thrust into his side, a rugged face projected itself alongside his, and the now husky voice of the clogger rang through the chapel as he cried, "Me!" It was over in a minute or two, and then there was a pause whilst the register was being signed in the vestry. "They're coming!" cried someone at last, and as the organ began Mendelssohn's Grand March, the band outside struck up a hymn tune, and the party left the chapel in the full blare of complete, if somewhat conflicting, musical honours. 2 years later, Jabe received a message to say that Doxie and her husband were coming to Beckside to bring the baby to be christened, and after many debatings, Sam Speck was sent off to Duxbury to buy a new font, with strict instructions that it was to be a full size larger than the Clough End one, and that he must be sure to bring it back with him for fear of accidents. When the young people arrived on the following Saturday, the clogger seemed as if he did not want to see the baby, but Doxie knew how it was with him, and very soon left it in his charge. A few minutes later it was squalling in the clog shop where Jabe had taken it to exhibit. "What's its name?" he demanded gruffly as Doxie came in and hastened to rescue her offspring from its clumsy nurse. "Oh, that is a secret. What do you think would be a nice name, Uncle?" Jabe knew nowt about such things, but he reckoned it would be saddled with some new-fangled nominee or other. The proud mother assured him that he was going to have the very nicest name in all the world, and next morning Jabe gave a loud grunt, which might be interpreted to mean wonder or satisfaction or almost anything else in the world, as standing up in his place in the chapel, he heard the little stranger solemnly endowed with the baptismal name of Jabez Longworth. End of Doxie Dent by John Ackworth. Read by Phil Benson.